This script covers Napoleon's absolute masterpiece at the Battle of Rivoli in January 1797, the final decisive blow that ended the Austrian presence in Italy. Following your specific requirements, the text is a continuous, high-density flow optimized for long-form TTS narration without any breaks, headers, or part numbers. Napoleon in Italy, the Battle of Rivoli, full TTS script. By January 1797, the war in northern Italy had reached its final and most explosive climax as the Austrian Empire launched its fourth and most massive attempt to break the siege of Mantua. General Alvinci had rebuilt his machine of war into a force of 28,000 men divided into 6 separate columns designed to descend upon the French positions from the mountains in a coordinated strike. Napoleon Bonaparte was facing a crisis of external order as his thin lines were stretched across the Adige Valley, and the reports from his scouts were a chaotic mess of conflicting data. However, Napoleon applied his principle of radical truth by riding through the night in a freezing winter storm to the plateau of Rivoli to see the enemy campfires for himself. He realized that the Austrians were attempting a complex encirclement, but their columns were moving at different speeds across the rugged terrain. This was the 5-step process in its purest form. Napoleon had the goal of destroying the last Austrian relief army. He identified the problem of the 6-pronged attack. He diagnosed that the terrain would prevent the Austrian columns from communicating. He designed a plan of interior lines to hit each column one by one, and he pushed through with a legendary intensity. On the morning of January 14, 1796, the battle began on the heights of the Rivoli Plateau. The French division under Joubert was nearly overwhelmed by the superior Austrian numbers, but Napoleon arrived with reinforcements from Massena's division, who had marched all night through the snow. This was the human machine at its limit. The French soldiers were performing alpha feats of endurance that the rigid Austrian bureaucracy could not comprehend. Napoleon directed his flying batteries of horse artillery to the edge of the plateau, where they poured a devastating, total concentration of force into the Austrian columns struggling up the narrow ravines. The most dramatic moment occurred when an Austrian column under Lusignan managed to get behind the French lines effectively surrounding Napoleon on the plateau. While his staff panicked, Napoleon remained a hyper-realist and calmly remarked that, "Those men are ours." He realized that the Austrian encirclers were themselves isolated and had no artillery support. He turned his reserve cavalry under Lasalle against them, while his infantry smashed the main Austrian center. The mechanical reality of the battlefield shifted in an instant as the Austrian columns began to collide with each other in the narrow passes. By the afternoon, the Austrian army was in a state of total disorder, and Alvinci's pride was shattered. Napoleon didn't stop to celebrate. He immediately realized that a second Austrian force under Provera was moving toward Mantua from a different direction. In a feat of aggressive persistence that remains one of the greatest in military history, Napoleon left Joubert to finish the battle at Rivoli and galloped 60 kilometers south with Massena's Iron Division to intercept Provera. They arrived at the gates of Mantua just in time to crush the final relief effort. The Battle of Rivoli was a masterpiece of manœuvres sur les derrières and interior lines that resulted in 14,000 Austrian prisoners and the total collapse of their Italian strategy. 2 weeks later, the great fortress of Mantua finally surrendered and the Austrian machine in Italy was dead. This victory was the ultimate logic of the campaign. It proved that a smaller, faster, and more unified force will always defeat a larger, fragmented one. Napoleon had moved from the abyss of 1996 to the total hegemony of 1997. He was now the undisputed shaper of the European continent, and the believability of his genius was etched in the minds of every monarch from London to St. Petersburg. Rivoli was not just a battle. It was the birth of the Napoleonic legend in its final form. Focus on the speed, embrace the cold reality of the data, and never let the enemy's numbers distract you from their structural weaknesses. This was the secret of Rivoli and the foundation of the empire that was now inevitable. The victory on the plateau of Rivoli on January 14, 1797, was a masterpiece of tactical concentration, but for Napoleon Bonaparte, a battle was never truly over until the enemy's entire strategic machine was dismantled. While the Austrian columns under Alvinci were being shattered in the mountain passes to the north, a second and equally dangerous threat was developing 60 kilometers to the south, where an Austrian relief force of 9,000 men under General Provera had successfully crossed the Adige River and was racing toward the gates of Mantua. Napoleon realized that if Provera linked up with the 28,000 starving defenders inside the fortress, his victory at Rivoli would be rendered meaningless, and the external order of the campaign would be reset. This was the ultimate test of aggressive persistence and the human machine. Despite his troops having fought a desperate day-long battle in the snow, Napoleon ordered Massena's Iron Division to turn around and march south immediately. This was a feat of endurance that defied the laws of 18th-century warfare. The French soldiers marched 60 kilometers in just 24 hours, fueled by the momentum of their success at the plateau. Napoleon himself galloped ahead to coordinate the design and plan of the final trap. On the morning of January 16th, Provera arrived at the suburb of La Favorita, just outside the walls of Mantua, expecting to be greeted by a breakout from the garrison under Wurmser. Instead, he found himself staring into the barrels of Napoleon's regrouped artillery. The French had executed a manœuvre sur les derrières on a grand strategic scale, catching Provera between the siege lines and the arriving divisions from the north. Napoleon applied his principle of total concentration of force at the decisive point, hitting Provera's column from three sides simultaneously. The Austrian general realized his machine was paralyzed. He was surrounded, his men were exhausted, and the promised breakout from Mantua had been easily repulsed by the French trenches. By the afternoon of the 16th, Provera was forced to surrender his entire force, including 5,000 prisoners and a massive supply train. This was the ultimate logic of the Rivoli campaign. Napoleon had defeated two separate armies in two different locations within 48 hours. The internal order of the Austrian high command in Vienna finally snapped as they realized that no matter how many men they sent into the abyss of Italy, the young Corsican general would simply move faster and strike harder. The psychological alpha was now entirely with the French. 2 weeks later, on February 2, 1797, the great fortress of Mantua, which had been the anchor of Austrian power for centuries, finally opened its gates. Field Marshal Wurmser surrendered 30,000 men and over 500 cannons, effectively ending the First Coalition's hopes of holding Italy. Napoleon treated the defeated Wurmser with a radical open-mindedness and respect that shocked the world, allowing the old general to march out with his honor intact, a move designed to build meaningful relationships for the future peace negotiations. The fall of Mantua was the final data point that proved the Napoleonic system was superior to the old monarchical bureaucracies. He had transformed a ragtag army into a continental superpower through the relentless application of logic, speed, and the five-step process. As he turned his eyes toward the Alpine passes leading to Vienna, the message was clear. The map of Europe was no longer a static document but a fluid reality that he alone would reshape. Focus on the transition from battle to pursuit, embrace the exhaustion of the climb, and never stop until the enemy's machine is completely offline. This was the secret of the race to Mantua and the reason the Napoleonic Empire was now a physical reality.